The stage was set long before the cameras began to roll. Washington was bracing itself for another clash of words, another battle not fought with armies or tanks, but with accusations and revelations that cut just as deeply. The room buzzed with an energy that felt almost electric. Journalists fidgeting with their recorders, aides whispering hurriedly, and viewers at home holding their breath. At the center of it all stood Jasmine Crockett, no stranger to controversy, no stranger to confrontation. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew that the next few minutes would not only dominate headlines, but potentially shift the national conversation. Her target tonight was not the former president himself, nor the usual architects of the MAGA movement. Instead, her words would be aimed directly at Barron Trump, the youngest member of the Trump dynasty, whose presence in politics had long been treated as something between a curiosity and a shield. Crockett wasted no time. She began by painting a picture of a young man thrust unwillingly into the spotlight, a reluctant participant in a game orchestrated by his family. She suggested, calmly at first, but with growing intensity, that Barron was not a political actor by choice, but by design. "Ask yourselves," she declared, her voice steady and sharp, "is this his voice we're hearing? Or is it the echo of a family desperate to maintain their grip on power?" The room stirred. Journalists scribbled notes furiously, their pens struggling to keep up with her pacing words. For the first time, someone had dared to pierce the veil of silence surrounding Barron's role, to suggest that his presence was not organic, but manufactured. It was a provocation designed not only to rattle her opponent, but to unsettle the entire narrative carefully woven by the Trump family. What made Jasmine Crockett's statement even more explosive was the way she framed the issue as a question of morality and responsibility rather than politics alone. She turned her gaze to the cameras and spoke as though addressing every household in America. "What does it say about a family," she asked, her tone deliberate and cutting, "when they choose to sacrifice their youngest for the sake of optics? When the narrative of strength is so fragile that it requires the presence of a child-turned prop to keep it alive?" It wasn't just a jab, it was an indictment. She painted a vivid picture of Barron as someone caught in a gilded cage, draped not in freedom, but in expectations placed upon him before he ever had a chance to form his own convictions. Crockett's words suggested that while Barron's image was being used to sell continuity, his voice had been stolen by a machinery of political calculation. The reaction was immediate. Analysts on cable networks rushed to interpret the blow. Commentators debated whether Crockett had crossed a line, and social media erupted with clips that spread like wildfire. Some defended Barron fiercely, insisting he should remain untouchable, shielded from the ugliness of partisan conflict. Others, however, admitted that Crockett had voiced a suspicion many quietly held, but never dared articulate, that the Trump family's political theater was a carefully curated act, and Barron was a reluctant performer trapped in its spotlight. The debate was not just about Barron anymore. It became about the ethics of political dynasties, about the way families brand themselves as movements, and about the cost imposed on those who never volunteered to serve. Crockett had done more than attack a name. She had pried open a wound in the nation's ongoing struggle with truth, image, and manipulation. The weight of Jasmine Crockett's remarks began to settle across the airwaves like a heavy fog. The press room itself seemed split down the middle. Half of the journalists leaned forward eagerly, sensing that this was history in the making, while the other half looked uneasy, as though they'd just witnessed a sacred boundary being shattered. Yet Crockett herself appeared unfazed. With the confidence of someone who had anticipated the backlash, she doubled down. She described Barron not as a figure to be pitied, but as an example of what happens when a family's obsession with legacy overrides the humanity of its members. Her voice took on a sharper edge as she spoke of an heir forced into politics, not because he sought it, but because his family could not imagine survival without him on stage. The phrase struck like a hammer. Networks quickly replayed the clip, isolating it for endless analysis. Was Crockett implying that Barron's every public moment was choreographed? That his presence was a desperate tool to project youth and continuity into a movement built on aging strongmen? Within minutes, hashtags erupted online, some defending Barron's right to privacy, others demanding answers about his real role in Trump's strategy. Even allies of the former president found themselves cornered by reporters asking uncomfortable questions. Was Barron truly free to choose his own path? The narrative spun outward like wildfire, bigger than Crockett alone. But what made her attack sting most was not just its audacity, but its plausibility. The idea that political dynasties sacrifice personal choice for power resonated with Americans weary of being sold staged authenticity. Crockett had framed Barron not as an untouchable child, but as the living proof of a family's political hunger, and in doing so, she ensured the debate would not vanish any time soon. As the storm of commentary continued to grow, Jasmine Crockett made a calculated choice to lean into the controversy rather than retreat. She stood at the podium, letting the silence linger just long enough for her next words to feel like a dagger. "What we are witnessing," she declared, "is not a young man stepping forward of his own free will, but a carefully scripted role, a mask designed to shield an empire that's terrified of collapse." Her voice rose, each syllable carrying both accusation and conviction. She accused the Trump family of staging scenes where Barron's presence became a distraction, an illusion meant to reassure supporters that the dynasty was secure, when in fact it trembled under the weight of its own contradictions. The reaction among Trump loyalists was immediate and furious. Spokespeople rushed to cable shows, calling her comments disgraceful, vile, and even borderline abusive. Yet Crockett's framing had already shifted the conversation. It was no longer about whether Barron should be shielded from public scrutiny, but whether his visibility itself was part of a deliberate political strategy. In living rooms and workplaces, people began to ask, if this is true, what else has been manufactured? Crockett had managed to inject a seed of doubt so potent that even attempts to discredit her only amplified the question further. Meanwhile, clips of her speech spread across every corner of social media. Memes, hashtags, and heated arguments flooded timelines. Supporters called her brave for pulling back the curtain on what many saw as a cynical game of legacy building. Detractors claimed she had gone too far, weaponizing a young man's privacy for political gain. Yet even in outrage, they couldn't stop repeating her words, ensuring that her accusation lived on in endless loops. For Crockett, this was not a misstep. It was a deliberate escalation, the kind of move that transformed a single debate into a defining narrative. By the fifth day of non-stop coverage, it was clear that Jasmine Crockett's words had ignited something far larger than a fleeting controversy. What began as a single exchange in a crowded hall had evolved into a national obsession. Editorial boards debated whether Crockett had crossed an ethical line, but even as they criticized, they couldn't resist amplifying her core accusation, that Barron Trump was not acting out of free will, but under the weight of family ambition. Crockett herself seemed undeterred by the backlash. Appearing in a late-night interview, she leaned forward in her chair and repeated her central point with unflinching clarity. We must ask ourselves whether this young man has been given a choice or whether he is being paraded as a trophy for a movement too desperate to let go of power. The phrasing was deliberate, almost surgical. Crockett understood that by framing the debate as one about freedom and autonomy, she was tapping into values deeply cherished by Americans across the political spectrum. It was no longer about left versus right, Democrat versus Republican. It was about whether any family, no matter how powerful, should sacrifice an individual's future for its own survival. Viewers who had once dismissed her as a fringe firebrand began to reconsider. Opinion polls, though early, showed a surprising shift. A growing number of independents agreed with her suggestion that Barron's role felt staged. The Trump camp scrambled to respond. Melania Trump issued a rare public statement, calling Crockett's remarks disgusting intrusions into family life. Donald Trump himself, at a rally, thundered that his family was being attacked unfairly and accused Crockett of exploiting his son for headlines. Yet, as his words echoed across the stadium, they sounded less like strength and more like desperation. For every denial he issued, another clip of Crockett's accusation replayed online, reminding audiences of the uncomfortable question at the heart of the storm. Was Barron's presence in politics really his choice, or was it the family's demand? The controversy surrounding Jasmine Crockett's accusations reached a fever pitch when networks began running split-screen coverage. On one side, clips of Barron Trump appearing solemn at campaign events. On the other, Crockett's fiery words replayed with bold captions about family pressure. The juxtaposition was devastating for the Trump brand. Every image of Barron now carried an undercurrent of doubt. Was he a willing participant, or merely a pawn in a legacy he had never asked to inherit? Crockett had succeeded in reframing not just a moment, but an entire narrative arc, one that gnawed at the public's imagination. In Congress, colleagues whispered about the audacity of her statements, yet many admitted privately that she had forced the nation to look at something uncomfortable. When cameras caught Crockett leaving a committee meeting, reporters swarmed her, eager for another headline. She didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned into the microphone and said, "If truth makes you uncomfortable, maybe it's not the truth that's the problem." The clip went viral instantly, flooding platforms with millions of views. Supporters celebrated her as fearless. Critics fumed that she was deliberately weaponizing youth for political gain. But either way, the spotlight refused to leave her. Inside Trump Tower, advisors scrambled for damage control. Anonymous leaks suggested deep frustration within the family. Some aides reportedly questioned the wisdom of putting Barron on stage at all, fearing Crockett's words had turned every appearance into evidence of manipulation. Yet pulling him back would only confirm the suspicion she had raised. It was a trap with no easy escape. The more they defended, the more her framing stuck. Political strategists across Washington quietly admitted that, win or lose, Crockett had delivered a masterclass in narrative warfare. She had shifted the ground beneath one of the most famous families in America and done it with a single piercing question: choice or coercion? By the seventh and final stretch of this unfolding drama, it became undeniable that Jasmine Crockett had succeeded in forcing a conversation the Trump family never wanted to have. The airwaves were saturated with pundits arguing over her motives, but one fact stood out above the noise. She had made Barron Trump's political role the centerpiece of national debate. From living rooms to lecture halls, Americans asked themselves whether a teenager could truly choose such a path, or whether he had been thrust into the spotlight by the insatiable hunger of dynastic ambition. Crockett's framing had cut through the usual partisan spin, piercing directly into the values of autonomy and agency that resonate deeply across the country. Her closing words during a primetime segment cemented this transformation. With calm intensity, she stated, "This is not about attacking a child. It is about questioning whether we, as a nation, will tolerate the exploitation of youth for political theater. Freedom must include the freedom to say no, even inside the most powerful family in America." The studio went silent before the applause swelled. In that moment, Crockett positioned herself not as an aggressor, but as a defender of principle. The contrast with Donald Trump's roaring denials and Melania's curt statements could not have been sharper. Where they projected defensiveness, Crockett projected moral clarity. The response was immediate. Hashtags carrying her message trended globally. Commentators dubbed her the voice of conscience in a media landscape otherwise defined by noise. Critics accused her of opportunism, but even in their outrage, they repeated her central message, giving it new oxygen. Crockett knew this was the essence of narrative warfare, not silencing critics, but ensuring that every repetition of their anger reinforced her frame. As the story settled into history, one reality lingered. Jasmine Crockett had struck a blow not only against a political dynasty, but against the silence that shields power. And for her growing audience, this was just the beginning. If you want to witness more unflinching truths, more confrontations that peel back the veil of power, stay with us. Subscribe, follow, and don't miss the next story, because the fight for truth is far from over.